Howdy everyone, this is the first lecture of about 11 that you'll be having, and this one's on the first chapter, basically what is psychology. I'll be trying to keep these short so you can rewatch them and study the concepts that we'll go through, but I like to highlight some of the things that the book mentions as well as things that the book does not mention that I think are important to consider. Remember that all of this is fair game for the test, whatever's in these slides as well as the textbook itself. So go through both mindfully. But just to get started, we're going to go through some of the basics of what psychology is, some contemporary perspectives on psychology in terms of where the roots of psychology are, where people work now and what those occupations sort of look like, and then where the modern field is going really over time. So basically psychology is, the science of the mind and how we live and behave and what we value, all sorts of things about ourselves. But this started a long time ago in philosophy with things called the biles, such as black bile and red bile. Red bile literally meaning the blood. Too much blood meant you were very vigorous or almost like too energetic. Anyways, this is kind of the idea that there's behaviors and there's mental processes. So remember that there's the sort of overt things. We say overt meaning things we can see, and then the things we can't see. I like to think psychological tests fall somewhere in the middle, where people having to check boxes and read questions, but it's really getting at those mental processes in order to fulfill the goals of psychology, which are to describe, predict, understand, and influence. In that we want to describe something like depression, what it is, their depressed emotions, as well as behaviors that happen, like lethargy and not wanting to get out of bed. We want to predict who that happens to and when it happens, as well as understand the roots of it, genetic and otherwise. We'll talk about genetics and neuropsychology a little bit, and then influence through drug therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, how people feel depressed. The three general points your book points out, which I think are interesting, are, knowing sort of what depends on, various things like good measurements, to get good conclusions. And then, of course, the amount of evidence or the degree that you feel confident in those measurements and conclusions that you draw from scientific studies really relates to how strong your opinion or the solidity or solidification of that opinion can be. And the field moves along the more evidence it has, what we'll call empiricism later on. The way we investigate these things happen in a lot of different areas. So there's education, what I do. So I teach, but I also do sort of the applied side a little bit. There's private practice, like clinicians might have, government agencies, as well as healthcare organizations that, reach out and sort of set mandates and prioritize care and things like that. This can be done through a number of different areas of psychology, or through people researching and teaching through different sort of perspectives, if you will. So these basic areas are bio, learning, memory, cognition. In this case, looking at those biological things, those things that we may be learning. So we're talking about behaviorism as a form of learning, but also those memory things dealing with Alzheimer's, how engrams are formed and lost. And then how we think. So some of the earliest forms of psychology were really focused on the idea of the foundation of mental thought that we're talking about in a little bit, with the first African-American psychologist, Henry Alston. Anyways, some other areas, like I said, were developmental, motivations, emotions, personality, and social psych, which my field of Irish psychology roughly fits into, which is the study of group behavior, things like groupthink. But also personality. There's differences between us, which is sort of led to the formulation of a lot of our statistical prowess, that psychometrician work that we call it. But we're also interested in how people develop and our motivation throughout our lifespan, and maybe difficulties with being motivated, maybe inappropriate motivations, or emotions or affective regulation problems that a lot of clinical psychologists deal with. We also have what I think is largely sort of glossed over in your book is what we call applied areas. So those are sort of foundational areas that I just mentioned, but those gave rise to applied careers, right, in clinical and counseling, where they're helping people understand and deal with and make decisions related to their psychology or psychological underpinnings that may, lead them towards better or, worse circumstances. Educational school psychology, of course, helps students that are, maybe in distress. Maybe there's issues or ways of coping with difficulties that can help them succeed. Here at Cal State Long Beach, we have a good center for that. That just got a new office, actually, so good for them. And then industrial organizational, what I do is, looking at people at work, and what I love about it is it's everything you can imagine applied to work. So whether that's clinical type ideas or motivational issues, whatever it is applied to work situations. Anyways, a lot of this is sort of guided by what we call the socio-cultural perspective. The idea that, we should look at people within their context, within their, culture, and understand them through that. Otherwise, we don't really understand the people if we don't look at the people within context, and that context can be culture, right? So in IR psychology, obviously different organizations are housed within different nations who have different cultures. And fully understanding what's going on is looking at it through that socio-cultural lens. One thing that's important to highlight is in some of these different disciplines, there's differences in the sort of degrees you get, right? So in psychology, we have psychiatrists and psychologists that do clinical psychology, the psychiatrists being the MDs who have, of course, prescription rights, whereas psychologists do not, but are often fighting for them because they tend to understand the issues at play a little bit better, but don't necessarily understand maybe the medical complications of certain drugs, yada, yada, yada. But I think the ball is moving towards psychologists getting at least limited prescription rights, even potentially certain counselors or family therapists getting some of those rights as well, which makes sense. These careers have evolved, of course, over time, to use the word evolve loosely, with different events, world events as well as psychology events, and I really like this chart from your book. One of the ones on this one that I think is important is, how you can see the first airplane coincides with about the introduction of the first IQ test, because we need to make sure that people can fly those planes. In IR psychology, we help place people within their sort of careers and things like that within World War I and World War II. Those sorts of things also sort of spurred IR psychology. They link World War II with the spread of clinical psychology, as you see in this one, but it was more important, I believe, for IR psychology, who did the Army Alpha and Army Beta tests to place people in the different branches of the military. And then later on, you can see where the I Have a Dream speeches. There was a lot of civil rights actions going on then, advancements in the rights of peoples, and that really related a lot to IR psychology as well, in that we deal a lot with discrimination, sexism, and a lot of the other isms that are negative in organizations. And obviously world events, national events like that have helped, including federal regulations to help workplaces more equitable. Anyways, some of the earlier theories that sort of accompanied these advancements started with, sort of structuralism and cognitive psychological principles. Structuralism specifically, J. Henry Alston, I mentioned earlier, was one of the first African-American psychologists. He looked at hot and cold and how, a hot pipe and a cold pipe intertwined, as that image shows, would produce severe heat reactions. So he's really interested in, okay, how is the brain structured? What's going on there? Same thing with Gestalt sorts of psychology we'll talk about later on, where we're looking at how our brain puts pieces together, like with the phi phenomenon, connecting lines that maybe shouldn't have been connected. This led to things like functionalism and later cognitive psychology. Functionalism relied a lot on the evolutionary principles of survival of the fittest, evolved things that are more adaptive tend to help us survive, and those things also would survive in the brain. So even something like extroversion would be advantageous for people that can connect them to resources and things like that. So one of the first, U.S. psychologists, William James, was instrumental in sort of pushing those ideas that were kind of, related to Darwin's sort of philosophy. So all this, like I said, led to cognitive psychology, the sort of idea of how we perceive, believe, think, remember, know things, decide things. These are all very, very interesting concepts that were evolving back then, understanding the brain. So, sort of a modern version of functionalism. Your book focuses a little bit on behaviorism as one of those early instrumental fields of psychology as well. The sort of concept that, observable, measurable behaviors are more important, let's say, and understanding those classical and operant conditionings that happen in our life, such as depicted in this comic with the dog, and in the original case, getting associated with the research assistant and pairing them with food. We also think about just social learning theory and what we see around us. Individuals getting rewarded around us make us, want to do the same behaviors to get rewarded as well. If you watch trash TV like I do, seeing some of the behaviors on TV, get rewarded, maybe influence your mind a little bit, whether you like it or not, right? A little bit later, psychoanalysis made sort of its sort of heyday, and that was mostly focused on Sigmund Freud, who people still rely on now. A lot of people criticize him, but he was the founder of a lot of important concepts like the id, the ego. Some of our motives is mentioned here, the sexual and aggressive motives that we feel towards things, and including the sort of unconscious and conscious mind. He influenced a lot of those things. There's neo-Freudians that still use a lot of those concepts. He mostly focused on the sexual. Some of his students, like Adler, more on the aggressive motivations that people have. And then, moving on, there's some branches that sort of reacted to that came about later on, like mostly in the 60s at some point with Carl Rogers and Maslow and Frankl, looking at the self-concept and what drives us. They believe that we all sort of have these positive attributes and aspirations, sort of like positive psychology mentioned in your book. The focus on these positive attributes and these desires are kind of what humanistic psychologists sort of did. And you can see, how it's related in this chart that I like to sociocultural perspectives, right? So what it means to be a good human or to have those positive strivings is really culturally specific. And, those can be loosely related even to maybe what we learn in our social environment. So, social learning theory and humanism could potentially go together as well. Anyways, you can't talk about this without mentioning neuropsychology, and we're talking about biopsychology and a little bit about nature and nurture, like your book points out, is one of those big debates. I don't know if it's necessarily a debate. We pretty much know that 50% basically comes from your genes and 50% from your environment, sometimes a little bit stronger than others. When we look at the bio perspective, you'll also see that depending on your genetic relatedness, that correlation of attributes with those around you goes up. So the more you're related to somebody, the more you share that genetic sort of predisposition to have certain personality traits. And then, of course, that leads you to environments that maybe enhance those traits or detract them. But anyways, there's an interplay there. And another thing that's important to point out is how, the different structures of the brain relate to different capacities, right? So emotions, for example, are located within a certain part of the brain that if it's damaged, your emotions go haywire. Same thing with speaking and even recognizing language. If certain areas are damaged, that can be very problematic. Anyways, make sure and read through your book and try to see where some of these concepts overlap, and I will talk to you again soon.